When buying or selling a home, when is a seller credit for repairs way better than having the seller actually do the work before closing? The answer? When there's not a lot of trust in the transaction. Now, my job as a real estate agent is to create an environment of trust, transparency, and collaboration for all people seated at the table. But sometimes, sadly, personalities and egos and communication styles clash in a way that makes solutions much harder to come by. I was working with a new client recently who was very cautious. It turns out he had been burned years ago on another deal, and understandably, in this new transaction with us, he was not prepared to take any chances. Our client was buying an investment property, and as part of the deal, the seller had agreed to put on a new roof before closing. Now, a new roof fully paid for by a seller is a big benefit to a buyer, but our client wasn't so sure, and he was skeptical right out of the gate. All these questions started coming up, asking how he could tell if the roofer would do a good job, how would he know the seller wouldn't hire the cheapest, most unqualified guy out there, and so on. And while those are fair questions, what the buyer is really telling you when you strip it down is that there's a lack of trust. And when there's a lack of trust on how work will be done and if it will be done well, immediately as an agent, you have to start exploring a credit as an alternative. The reason is because when you have two strangers coming together in a deal and there's a lack of trust, warranted or not, a credit simplifies things. Now, I'm not saying that a credit is always the right way to go in a repair negotiation, but when there's a lack of trust and the buyer wants control over how something is handled, a credit paves a much smoother path towards closing. In this case, that's what we were able to get for him. If you consider the alternative, in the best case scenario, the seller does the work with their own qualified specialists and does a great job. But the buyer, who's skeptical, having been burned in the past, hires a different contractor for a reinspection, and there's a disagreement over how something was done. Even if it's somewhat immaterial to the roof doing its job, it's a gray area of opinion that can create quicksand for a deal. While a credit can be more expensive for a seller in some cases, it does remove the seller from any liability on how the work is done. It's a clean solution that paves a much smoother ride to closing and takes out last-minute speed bumps completely out of the way.